Today, we're doing a deep dive into the world's river systems. We're trying to get a handle on something really fundamental to the biodiversity crisis. What actually drives species invasions on a big scale?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not just talking about, one species in one lake. We're looking at how human development seems to be fundamentally rewriting the rules of ecology across the globe. And our main source for this is a pretty landmark paper from 2008. It's called Fish Invasions in the World's River Systems. When natural processes are blurred by human activities, led by Leprieur, they tackle this huge question of invasibility on a scale that really hadn't been done before.
No, it was quite ambitious, and the stakes, well, they couldn't be higher, could they? Species invasions are, they're a principal driver of this whole human-caused biodiversity crisis. If we can't figure out the major global determinants, where these invaders actually get established, then we're essentially flying blind trying to set up effective conservation policy.
Right. And freshwater fish, they turn out to be a really good group to study for this kind of macro-scale question. They're introduced all over the place, often with, pretty terrible results for native ecosystems.
And critically, rivers act as these sort of natural laboratories. Each river basin is effectively a separated biogeographical island. Fish can't just, hop from the Amazon over to the Congo easily. And that separation helps researchers isolate and sort of disentangle the role of natural factors from the factors driven purely by us, by human activity.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the paper's mission was basically to test three big, often competing ideas about why non-native species manage to establish themselves in new places.
Precisely. Yeah, they wanted to see which theory really held up when you look at the whole planet. Let's start with the one we suspect we influence the most, the human element. They call this the human activity hypothesis.
That sounds pretty intuitive, right? The idea that if we humans mess with a place, invaders are more likely to show up.
Well, yes, but it's a bit more nuanced. This hypothesis predicts invasions happen because of two main things. First, human disturbance itself, think habitat changes like dams, pollution. And second, increased propagule pressure.
Propagule pressure. That's a term for, how many individuals arrive and how often.
Exactly. It's the frequency and the sheer number of non-native species being introduced, usually through economic stuff, the ornamental fish trade, stocking for aquaculture, or sport fishing.
Gotcha. So if this human activity hypothesis is the main driver, we'd expect to see a strong positive link between invasions and things like urban density, human population, and especially economic measures like GDP, gross domestic product.
Exactly right. Then you have the two more sort of traditional ecological explanations. These focus more on the native environment itself. The second hypothesis is biotic acceptance. The idea here is basically that habitats which are naturally really good for native species, maybe systems with lots of energy or diverse physical structures, they're also good for non-native species.
Okay, so it's like what's good for the natives is good for the newcomers too.
That's the gist, yeah. Sometimes called the rich get richer idea ecologically. If you have a thriving, species-rich river, maybe it's actually easier for non-natives to just slot in.
Which seems a bit counterintuitive to the third idea, right? Biotic resistance.
That's the flip side, and it's probably what many people, maybe ecologists included, might intuitively expect.
That a strong, diverse native community should fight back, put up barriers.
Exactly. Biotic resistance predicts that species-rich native communities are really competitive. They form a kind of natural barrier that should actively impede or slow down the establishment of non-native species. So if this hypothesis was dominant globally, you'd expect a negative relationship. Richer native ecosystems should actually have fewer non-native species.
Okay, so three competing ideas. Human impact makes it easy, rich places accept more, or rich places resist invasion. And they set out to test these using it must have been a truly massive data set.
Oh, the scale is just astonishing. They pulled together data on over 40,000 occurrences of nearly 10,000 fish species, and they mapped all this across 1,055 river basins around the world.
Wow, 1,055 basins. That covers most of the planet's land surface.
More than 80% of the Earth's continental surface. Yeah, it's incredible coverage.
And that scale really matters because, like you said, human factors and environmental factors often overlap. People tend to build cities near productive rivers, for instance.
Yes, exactly. In smaller regional studies, it's almost impossible to untangle cause and effect because of that covariation. Things are just too mixed up. So the researchers had to use some pretty powerful analytical modeling, generalized linear models, hierarchical partitioning, basically sophisticated math to try and slice through that noise. They wanted to figure out which of their key variables, both human and environmental, was independently driving the invasion patterns they saw. They were looking for that independent explanatory power.
Right, to separate the signals.
Yeah.
And that complex analysis, it led them to their first big finding, identifying the global hotspots where fish invasions are already really bad. They found 6 major areas where non-native species make up over 25% more than a quarter of all the fish species in those river basins.
What's fascinating here is, well, these aren't just random spots on the map. They really represent this geographic intersection of economic power and biological vulnerability.
And the list itself is pretty significant. It includes the Pacific coast of North and Central America, Southern South America, Western and Southern Europe,
Yep.
Central Eurasia, South Africa and Madagascar, and then Southern Australia and New Zealand.
A really widespread pattern. But the real conservation alarm bell rings when you connect that list to data from the IUCN Red List, the list of threatened species. These same 6 invasion hotspots are also the areas characterized by the highest proportion of fish species that are already at a high risk of extinction.
Wow. So the geography of invasion lines up almost perfectly with the geography of maximum risk for biodiversity loss. You're seeing the biggest impacts, right, where the systems are seemingly most open to invasion and where the native fauna is most threatened.
It's a dangerous combination.
Okay, so now we get to the really crucial part, the results of testing those 3 hypotheses.
Okay.
Human factors versus ecological factors. What did the analysis show? Which hypothesis won out globally?
Well, it was remarkably clear. The human activity indicators, taken together, accounted for most of the global variation in non-native species richness. It was highly consistent with that human activity hypothesis.
Most of the variation. How much are we talking about here?
The human factors collectively had the greatest independent effect. They explained over 70% of the independent contribution to invasibility worldwide.
70%, that's huge. It means the natural factors, things like climate, river size, native biodiversity, they're all scrambling for the remaining 30% of influence.
Pretty much, yeah. It suggests an almost complete domination by human influence at this global scale.
And here's where it gets really interesting. What was the single strongest predictor out of everything they looked at?
It wasn't river discharge, it wasn't temperature, it wasn't even native species richness, it was GDP, gross domestic product.
An economic index.
Yes. An economic index reflecting the scale of human activities had the greatest independent explanatory power. It accounted for 43% of the overall effect all by itself.
Hold on, are you saying the single biggest predictor of whether a river system gets invaded by non-native fish isn't necessarily an environmental factor in isolation, but purely economic development?
That's the unavoidable conclusion from this global analysis, yes.
That changes the whole conversation about conservation policy, doesn't it?
It really does. The biogeography of fish invasions globally seems to be dictated by the geography of human economic impact. It's completely blurring, maybe even overriding natural ecological processes.
Well, let's dig into why. Why does high GDP translate so effectively into success for invasive fish? The paper talked about 3 potential links, right? They weren't mutually exclusive.
That's right. First, economic development often means more habitat disturbance. Think big infrastructure projects, dams, reservoirs, straightening river channels. All of these mess with natural river flows. These disturbed, often less stable environments can be easier for adaptable, generalist, non-native species to colonize.
Okay, that makes sense. Second, GDP drives commerce and trade.
Exactly, which means high rates of economic exchange, and that leads directly to increased propagule pressure. When you have a wealthy economy, you tend to have a bigger market for exotic ornamental fish, maybe more interest in stocking non-native fish for sport, more extensive aquaculture. Every single one of those activities is basically an open door for introductions, sometimes intentional, sometimes accidental.
And the third mechanism they mentioned was related more to just general consumption patterns.
Yeah, essentially. The increased demand for imported products that generally comes with economic prosperity just ups the chances of unintentional introductions. You're shipping more goods around the world, maybe live goods, maybe just packaging containing potential hitchhikers. Escapes can happen during import. It seems to be a direct function of global commerce and human settlement density, both often linked to GDP.
Okay, so the human activity, especially economic activity, is clearly the dominant force. Now, what about those other 2 ecological hypotheses, biotic acceptance and biotic resistance? Once you accounted for that massive 70% human factor, Did those natural dynamics still play a significant role?
At the global scale analyzed here, no, not really. For biotic resistance, they found no significant negative relationship between high native species richness and non-native richness once they controlled for the human factors.
So that classic ecological idea that diverse systems are inherently stable and competitive enough to keep invaders out, that just didn't hold up on this global level.
It seems it was essentially drowned out by the human signal. A diverse native community isn't necessarily a strong barrier against non-native establishment if human economic activity is providing that huge boost to invasibility.
And the same thing happened with biotic acceptance, the rich get richer idea.
Correct. After controlling for human factors, they found no significant positive relationship either. Species-rich river basins didn't support significantly more non-native species than poorer ones once you've factored out the human impact. So in this context, that environmental optimum argument, what's good for natives is also good for non-natives, it seems largely irrelevant compared to the overwhelming influence of human activity.
Wow. The conclusion feels really stark then. The global map of fish invasions matches the map of human economic impact, not the map of native biodiversity patterns. Human economic activity has, as the title says, completely blurred those natural processes.
It's a powerful finding.
So what does this all mean? What are the big takeaways for future conservation strategies, especially knowing that GDP is such a major predictor?
Well, the study paints a very clear picture of where immediate focus is needed. For those 6 global invasion hotspots they identified where native species are already known to be at high risk, the authors make a strong recommendation. They suggest that non-native species importations should basically be prohibited outright in those areas.
Prohibited entirely.
Yes, unless, perhaps, exceptions are made following extremely detailed risk assessments and, crucially, long-term cost-benefit analyses. The default should be prohibition in those critical zones.
That's a very direct policy recommendation. But there's also a pretty serious warning flag in this data for developing countries, isn't there?
Absolutely. Because the human activity hypothesis, and specifically the economic activity link, is so strongly supported, the authors express real fear about massive invasions becoming imminent, particularly in river basins within developing countries that are currently experiencing rapid economic growth.
Which parts of the world are most vulnerable in that scenario?
They highlight regions like Southern Asia and also Western and Central Africa. The big concern there is that these areas often have extremely high levels of endemism.
Meaning unique species found nowhere else.
Exactly. Unique, irreplaceable species. So you have this potential conservation tragedy brewing. As these nations develop economically, which is obviously important for human well-being, they might inadvertently trigger devastating invasions that threaten their most unique natural heritage.
It's a tough connection. We should probably briefly mention a limitation the authors themselves pointed out.
Sure.
While the study's findings are strong, the data on threatened species they used from the IUCN Red List,
Yeah.
well, it might be an underestimate, right? Simply because the assessment process for freshwater fish wasn't fully complete everywhere back in 2008.
That's a fair point, a necessary caveat. But it certainly doesn't undermine the central thesis about human economics driving the overall invasion pattern. If anything, the threat level might be even higher.
Right, so overall, the really big finding from this paper seems crystal clear. If you want to predict where invasive fish are likely to take hold globally, don't just look at the local ecology. You really need to look at the economics. Human economic activity is the overwhelming driver, dominating those natural ecological relationships on a global scale.
Yeah, it's a powerful message. And looking forward, the authors really urged future research to take this invasion pattern data and combine it with other global data sets. Specifically, databases that track physical disturbances, things like river fragmentation from dams or changes in water flow regulation. Only by sort of holistically quantify all these different sources of human threat can we really hope to design comprehensive, effective interventions.
Makes sense. Get the full picture of human impact.
And they also stress the need to see if these findings hold true for other types of organisms. Do these same rules where GDP seems to dominate ecology apply to invasive plants or insects or amphibians, for example? That's a big open question, but perhaps the most provocative thought this research leaves us with, for you, the listener, to consider, is this. Given that the study pinpoints GDP, economic activity, as the single greatest predictor of ecological vulnerability for these river systems, how should international conservation policies adapt? How can we better protect those highly endemic rivers in developing nations before their rapid economic growth potentially triggers massive, maybe irreversible invasions? Tackling that proactive policy challenge seems like the urgent next step this research demands.